Our topic today is Shmita. Our Shmita actually is just the continuation of what we've been doing in some sense. This is mitzvah number 84. You may recall that mitzvot 79 through 83 had to do with court cases and had to do with not taking bribes and things along those lines. And so now Sefer Parshat Mishpatim, which we've been learning, sort of takes a twist and it introduces us to the laws of Shmita. And you'll see also that these mitzvot appear again in mitzvot 326, 327, 328, and 329. These are all the details of Shmita, which appear connected. The Sefer Chinuch, for those of you not familiar, the Sefer Chinuch is a chronological order of how the mitzvot appear in each parsha. So we're going through the parsha we started in Bereshit. We're now up to Parshat Mishpatim, and there is a mention of Shmita in Mishpatim, but the real details of Shmita appear in Parshat Bahar, which is in Vayikra, and that's why I brought the source in Vayikra as well. And then it appears actually again in Sefer Dvarim, dealing with loans and things along those lines. And we will get to that when we get to Dvarim. Let me just read the verse that the mitzvah first appears in Parshat Mishpatim. Sheish shanim tizra, right? You shall, for 6 years you shall plant your land, and you will gather up all of its produce. And then it continues, but in the 7th year, hashvi'it, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive gardens. It gives the impression that what is the purpose of this mitzvah of leaving your land to lay fallow? What's the message of it? Sorry? For poor people, right? It seems to be a socio-economic concern, which is why this would make sense to be in Parshat Parshat Mishpatim. We're dealing with interpersonal relationships. If you remember the mitzvot we did last week, we had the mitzvot of dealing with having fairness. Don't favor the poor, don't favor the rich when it comes to a court. We also had the mitzvah of helping the donkey of your enemy. These are interpersonal relationships. This has to do with helping the poor, having a great deal of sensitivity and concern for them. I've spoken previously about how Shmita is actually part of an entire system, sort of an economic system, to prevent slavery. That in the ancient world, and you see this very well with Egypt, and particularly when Yosef was involved, but it wasn't Yosef who actually introduced the concept. What would happen is that you would have people who were basically poor, almost like a feudal system, right? There was the wealthy landowner, and then there are people who worked the farms. If there is a drought, they don't have a good year to pay off their loans, so they take a loan because the next year they have to buy seed. And then if there's one more year of drought, they don't have enough money to pay off to repay for their seed, so they have to sell something. So they usually would sell their animals. The next year, you're right, it's a vicious cycle. By the way, very often in these times, the amount you'd have to pay back, the interest, was not 5% or 10%. It could be 25 or even 50%. They could never get over that hump, and then the next year they wouldn't be able to afford to buy back their animals. In fact, they didn't have any animals now to work their farms, so they even had even if there was rain. And so they therefore would then have to sell something else. Very often they'd have to sell parts of their land. That's how the entire feudal system in Europe developed. How these wealthy landowners, how did they acquire more and more land? It's because they lent out to people they knew would not be able to pay them back, and eventually they'd have to sell themselves into slavery. And so the Torah comes along and says, that's never going to happen again. When we leave Egypt, we're leaving the concept of slavery, not just our personal slavery, but this economic enslavement. And so therefore we have a whole series of systems. Don't lend to the poor on interest. That's so it never gets to that point in time. Shmita, you'll cancel the debts. Yovel, at the 50th year, you return the land. So no one could ever, for more than a generation, not have any of their ancestral lands. So it does seem that that's the meaning of this mitzvah, at least as we read the verse in the Torah. And indeed, the Rambam, if you look down below, in Mor Nevuchim, he gives two reasons for the mitzvah. And this is the first one. I brought the Hebrew, but you can also see in the English below. Vayider Shem el Moshe, Bahar Sinai Lemor. He's now quoting from the verse in Vayikra. I'm sorry. Vayikra is Bahar. I'm sorry, skip down to the Rambam Mor Nevuchim. I thought I had done the Hebrew translation. I didn't. As to the precepts enumerated in the laws concerning the year of release, that's the Shmita, and the Jubilee, the Yovel, some of them imply sympathy with our fellow man and promote the well-being of mankind. For in reference to these precepts, it is stated in the law that the poor of thy people may eat. Right? It's a concern for the poor. There is, however, a challenge that many people want to argue against the Rambam and say that it has nothing to do with the poor. You can see this actually in the words as well. First of all, it says that your poor can eat imcha, with you. In other words, when it comes to the laws of Shmita, and you would let your fruits and your harvest lay fallow, it was open to everyone. It wasn't open just to the poor. It was open to the rich and the poor equally. Another example where it doesn't necessarily favor the poor, you had to declare your land ownerless. You were not allowed to work it at all. If in fact your concern is for the poor, might it be more beneficial to say that you have to work this year, but everything that you gain in this year goes to the poor? By the fact that you're not working, you actually produce less fruit, less food. And so if the real concern was just for the poor, this is not necessarily the best way of doing it. In fact, taking a year off of work from everyone, if you think about a modern society, if the entire society took a year off from work and didn't produce wealth for 1 year, the poor do not benefit necessarily from that, right? If the entire economy begins to collapse, the poor are very often the first ones to suffer, that the safety net that exists doesn't exist for them. In periods of famine, for example, the poor suffer more than the wealthy, right? The wealthy have been able to stockpile and put things aside, and the poor haven't been able to do that. So the many attack the Rambam and say it's not about concern for the poor. It's a so that's the second reason that the Rambam gives. So the first reason he says, I'm sorry, you're reading from the Mor Nevuchim or? Oh, from Shmot, right. You should rest the land and let it lie fallow. Oh. And then it's for the concern for, correct. Okay, so I made it the first because that's how the Rambam counts it. If you look in the Mor Nevuchim, he starts off by saying it's first for the sympathy of the poor, but you're right, he then gives a second reason, which is the first reason in Mishpatim, that you let it lay fallow. And the Rambam actually says, if you look in the Mor Nevuchim, the fourth line, he says, after the quoting of Shmot 23:11, and besides, the land will also increase its produce and improve when it remains fallow for some time. That when you it's for the land, as you said. It's to let the land rest. That when you let the land rest, it actually produces more in the future. In fact, the people who have probably proven this to a certain extent, to a large extent, is Israeli farmers. That they're letting plots. It allows. There's a whole series of scientific benefits in terms of the nitrogen that is produced, in terms of the arable nature of the land, that it actually is usually more successful in subsequent years. There's also a verse, I'm sorry? Rotation of crops. So many people do rotation of crops, although what the most scientists today suggest, you can rotate crops for even 3 months or 6 months at a time, and it has a benefit. But the best benefit it actually says is if you were to leave for a full year to allow everything to take place. And by the way, when we leave fallow, one of the interesting verses, one of the attacks that people have against the Rambam saying, if it's really socioeconomic and concern for the poor, why does the verse say it's for the poor to eat as well as everyone else, and everything else left over, let the animals eat? Why do we care about the animals if we're concerned primarily about the poor? And so I was thinking about this a little bit. Have any of you ever been to the Kibbutz Sdei Eliyahu? They have a tour of their organic type of farming. They're known for their bees, right? Rather than using pesticides, they have bees that are used. They have owls all over the place to eat the rodents. And rather than having to put pesticides, again, they have these owls. And one of the things they're most famous for is their dates don't use any pesticides at all. But what they do is they have donkeys. and they have something like 15 donkeys that just roam where all their palm dates are. And what they do is they eat up all the weeds, and they also then excrete everything that they've eaten. They just live there the whole time. And the dates actually grow much better because the soil is fertilized naturally. And so one of the things I think also that's perhaps taking place there, when you let the land lay fallow for a year, but you have animals eating it and coming there on a constant basis, you actually strengthen the land for the future. So that's one of the things the Rambam says, is that it has a sort of an ecological benefit to it. However, there's an attack, I would say, also against the Rambam in this ecological element, because if in fact this is what's best for land, so first of all, one of the punishments that appears later in Devarim says that if you don't keep the Shmita year, you'll be exiled from the land. Meaning, just if this is really in our benefit, that we're going to do really well, do we really need to then be punished if we don't do it? It's for our own benefit. But more than that, if it's really for the benefit of the land, why not then have this as a mitzvah, not just connected to Eretz Yisrael? Meaning, it's all God's land. We want all the land to be productive. Why not say this is a positive thing for everything? Why uniquely specific to Eretz Yisrael? I have a potential answer to that as we go through some of the additional answers that are suggested. I think we could defend the Rambam, but I don't think we have to. The Rambam stands for what it is. He certainly teaches that there's a few ideas that are out there, but there are a number of different suggestions as well, and one of them is going to connect to Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So let's look at the Sefer Chinuch now for a moment. The Sefer Chinuch actually offers us 4 reasons why we should keep Shmita. So the first answer that he gives is, I think he connects the concept to Shabbat. And that you can actually see very nicely if we go back up before we read the Sefer to Vayikra. When it appears again, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Bahar Sinai Lemor, Dibur el Bnei Yisrael, Marta Elhem, and say to them, Kitavu el haaretz asher ani noten lachem, I'm giving you this land. The Shifta haaretz Shabbat Lashem, that you shall let the land rest. It is a Shabbat for Hashem. By the way, on this, the Netziv says, this is proof that the Rambam is wrong, that it's not for the purposes of the benefit of the land, because it says it's a Shabbat Lashem, not for the land, but somehow for God, not connected to the land. 6 shanim, 6 years you shall plant your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyards. You'll collect all of the yield. Uvashana Shabbat Shabbaton, it's a Shabbat of Shabboses. Yeh la'aretz Shabbat Lashem, it'll be the land will be a rest for Hashem. Your field you shall not prune and the like. I just want to go a little further. The last line, V'haita Shabbat lahaaretz lechem la'achla, it'll be for you to eat, U'la'avdecha, and your servant to eat, V'amatcha, right, and your maidservant, the person who is renting, to the residents of the land, as well as the gerim, the resident strangers that are with you. Also for your land, for the animals and that are in your land. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like what we say on Shabbat, right? Right? It's the same language. And so many want to make the connection between Shabbat and Shmita. 6, 7, it's the exact same parallel in that regard. And that's what the Sefer Chinuch begins with. Sefer Chinuch says as follows. If you go on the top of the right-hand side in the English, it is from the roots of this commandment to affix in our hearts and make a strong impression on our minds about, number 1, I put in the numbers. I feel like he put 4 answers. Maybe he put a 5th as well. But 1, the matter of the world having been created. Right? That's what Shabbat is all about. Remind us that the world is created. The Sefer Chinuch feels that there was a philosophical argument of many people who said the world was not created. It always existed. Right? There was no beginning. There's no end, which in a sense removes God from the picture. We are all just, in a sense, a product of some type of accidental molecular crash billions of years ago, there were some type of things in the atmosphere. They smashed against one another, and they somehow created life. That's one way of looking at the creation of the world, and the Sefer Chinuch says we reject that clearly. And the way we show that we reject it is through Shabbat, by saying God created the world and rested on Shabbat. And Shmita is to make that exact same point, that it is not just all by coincidence that the world came into being, but rather there is a God that created the world, and every time we, in a sense, protect the cycle, 6 days, 6 years, right, 6 and 7, we testify that God created the world. By the way, 7 is not natural, right? Day and night as a delineation of time is natural, right? You see the sun, you see the moon. The month is natural. The moon waxes and wanes. The seasons are natural. You can see them. But 7 is not natural. The whole world maintains it. It's a Jewish invention, though, right, of saying 7. In fact, it wasn't always the case that it was a 7-day work week. That's Jewish creation. In fact, the Soviets during in 1929 and then in the 1930s, and until around 1940 something, I don't remember exactly when, experimented with a different work week. They had it a few times. The first attempt was to do something where they would have a 5-day work week straight, meaning you would work 5 days, and then you work another 5 days, and then another 5 days, another 5 days, and each person had 1 day off within that consecutive 5-day work week, but it wasn't the same day off. In fact, there you could see these old charts. They were color-coded, and 20% of the workforce would be given one color, and so forth and so on. And part of the Soviet plan, of course, was to break up a lot of different things. One of the things they broke up is religion, because if everyone doesn't have Sunday off to go worship, but 20% of the people have Monday and 20% of the people have Tuesday, so they could never really put together a church. The other thing that they surprisingly were breaking up is the bonds of the family. Right? There were complaints you can read some of these old complaints in Russian newspapers where someone would say, what good does it do me to have my day off, on Monday if my wife is working and I only see her later, or my kids are going to school and we don't have a vacation at all. And so some suggest that was part of the sort of the Marxist technique, was to break down family and to break down religion by doing this. And little by little, you can see these old date books that people had, whereas they would try to remember what color their friends were, so they could try to coordinate. And little by little, actually, the Soviets, there was a lot of pushback, and eventually they had to abandon the entire thing and return to the 7-day work week. They experimented trying to defeat it, but they couldn't do it. And you might argue, why did the 7-day work week take control, right? Why not, if we go, for example, except for Americans, right? Everyone uses the metric system. Why not have a 10-day and then a break at the end? That seems, in a sense, more natural with all the other measurements we have. But there shows the power of 7, which to a certain extent is the Jewish proclamation, and those who have followed in our ways, the Judeo-Christian, of admitting that God created the world. So every time you see 7 anywhere in the Torah, the Sefer Chinuch would remind you, this is about making this philosophical argument. I would say there's also a moral argument that's being made as well. Because if we are just molecules, right, that happen by accident, what is the source of morality, right? If all I am is a collection of atoms that do one thing, what's the difference between the atoms, the molecules that make up my body and that make up a loaf of bread? And then, God forbid, what's the difference from a moral point of view of baking bread or breaking, God forbid, a human being, right? If we're all just accidental molecules that smash together, there is no morality. And so also introducing this concept introduces the notion of morality to the entire world. So that's the first point that the Sefer Chinuch makes about what Shmita may all be about. The second thing that I think the Sefer Chinuch wants to focus on, if you see I have the number 2, it's about a little more than halfway down that big paragraph. And it's the 4th word in there, or so that, number 2, a person will remember that the land which produces fruits for him every year does not produce them by its own might and virtue. You didn't produce this fruit that's growing. That's the amazing thing, right? Most of the work that's done is done by the earth, done by this miraculous power that is there, not by me. For there is a master over it and its master, and when God wishes, he commands him to take place. In other words, and then it goes on to say, and therefore you declare it ownerless, and when you say the land is Hefker, it's not mine, on the seventh, you're actually reminded it's never really yours. It's all owned by God. It's all God's land. And that's, there's a certain amount of humility, I think, when you make this statement. By the way, in this, making this statement, Rav Rimon also points out, this might support the Rambam's position that it's fundamentally about helping the poor. He says, because once you realize that it's not your land, he says, what is the source of most conflict in the world? It's disagreement over possession. It's possession of land, possession of wealth, possession of people. That's what we get into arguments about. When we argue it out on the street, that's my parking spot. No, it's my parking spot. Think of all the different fights that you have. Even what we think are sort of emotional disagreements, a lot of them, they're disagreements over, I thought I deserved better treatment, right? It's, I believe I deserved something, that it was mine, that it was due me. And so that's what most of the fights take place. Once you realize nothing is mine, right? There's a famous story, I think, told about the Vilna Gaon, if I'm not mistaken, that someone heard the Vilna Gaon is this great scholar living in Vilna. And so he wanted to, had an opportunity, he was involved in business, had an opportunity to visit Vilna, so he goes into the Vilna Gaon's office, and I may be making a mistake, it may be the Chafetz Chaim. It's one of those sainted individuals. A person goes into his office, and he's surprised, and he looks around, and it's not very elaborately decorated at all. In fact, it's basically relatively empty. I mean, there's the Beit Midrash outside with all the books, but where he said, there's really nothing there. And the person said to, the visitor said, where's all your stuff? And the Vilna Gaon responded and says, well, where's all your stuff, right? And the guy who was visiting, he says, well, I'm just traveling, I'm just passing by, so I don't bring everything with me. I'm just passing through. To which the Vilna Gaon respond, well, I'm also just passing through. What do I need all this stuff for if we're just passing through? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Chafetz Chaim makes more. You know, there's a story about the Chafetz Chaim. If I steal a story from him, I should add a story, right? So we don't leave him without a story. So they tell the story about the Chafetz Chaim that he was once brought in to testify and be a character witness for a person, a Jew who was accused of something. And so the lawyer wanted to show how saintly the Chafetz Chaim is to the judge. So he wanted to impress upon the judge that you can really trust this individual. And so he started to tell the story about the Chafetz Chaim, about once when a person stole from him, broke into his office or broke into his house and stole something from him and was running away. The Chafetz Chaim ran after and says, it's all Hefker, it's all Hefker. Meaning the Chafetz Chaim was so concerned for this thief's spiritual well-being, he didn't want him to be considered guilty of stealing. So the Chafetz Chaim would say, whatever you took from me is ownerless. I don't own it, and therefore the person isn't then stealing anything. So this was to impress the judge how saintly the Chafetz Chaim was. And the judge, looked down from his podium and says, come on, do you really want me to believe that story, that this guy ran after him and say, it's Hefker, you can take it, you can take it? And the lawyer says, I don't know if the story is true or not, but they don't tell those stories about you and me, right? So whether or not the Chafetz Chaim is as saintly as we say he is, the fact that we tell stories about him and not about us, he must have something going for him. Okay. So there is this element, sort of a social element. Even by declaring its ownerless, there is a social element, certainly, that takes place there. Others point out, for example, it's not natural, for example, to want to cancel someone's debt. If someone owes you money, you're not naturally inclined to say, don't worry about it. But there is a joy, if you've ever done that, if you've ever been able to give something to someone else, there's a joy in it. And so the Torah, in a sense, almost helps us to achieve that joy, because you wouldn't naturally leave money on the table, but once you are told you have to give up the debt, you're actually happy that you've done it. And so the Torah helps you in that regard. There's also another interesting aside here, I think. For those of you who are around the last Shmita year, What do you do with fruit that is grown b'kedusha in holiness in Israel on the Shmita year? You can't treat it like regular fruit. We'll come back to that idea. You can't just throw it away, right? Do you remember that from the laws of Shmita? You have to, first of all, it's based upon our verse. Our verse, we said, says that this food is for you, la'ochla, to eat. So the commentaries there say, la'ochla velo l'schora, for eating and not for business purposes. You're not allowed to make money off fruit on the Shmita year, and so you have to do something else with it. The Ramban actually says, no, it's a mitzvah actually to eat fruit on Shmita year. You have to go out and you should search it out. You shouldn't try to get away with eating other fruit. It's a mitzvah to actually enjoy God's world and to eat that fruit. It reminds me of a Gemara in the Yerushalmi in Kiddushin, which says that there was one rabbi who was so concerned about making sure he appreciated everything that God created, that he would plant for himself every single type of fruit tree that he could possibly grow and eat from it every year. Because he was nervous that when he would go to heaven, God would say to him, did you enjoy this fruit? Did you enjoy that fruit? And he hadn't tasted it. That if God gives you a present, you should enjoy it. That, by the way, is based upon a Meshech Chochmah. There's a beautiful Meshech Chochmah in Breshit. What's the first mitzvah, or what's the first command God gives Adam? So, Puravu is the first mitzvah, but when I ask this to a group of young people, say, what's the first thing God told man that he's supposed to do or not do? And everyone says, oh, you're not supposed to eat from the tree, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge. But that's not what it says. The Torah says, eat from all of the trees, just don't eat from this one tree. It's like if you take a kid to a supermarket and say, you can eat absolutely everything in the supermarket except this one thing. Now, unfortunately, that one kid now wants that one thing. But you would not call the parent stingy. You would actually say the exact opposite. The parent's incredibly generous. And the Meshech Chochmah says, we misunderstand God if we focus on that negative command rather than the positive, I've given you everything to enjoy. And just as if a person gives you a gift and you never use it, it's an insult. In the same way, this rabbi felt that he should plant everything because God's given me this gift. I should take advantage of it. And that's the Ramban also. He says you should eat from the fruit of the Shmita. Yeah, it's an interesting. So first of all, it's not just the seventh year. We have a tithing of Maser Oni, right? There are a couple times in that 7-year cycle where you do give specifically to the poor. You're right about tithing. There's actually a machloket about when we give 10% to tzedakah, is that a Torah command or is that a rabbinic enactment later on? And what many people suggest actually is yes, it's a rabbinic command, not a Torah, because the Torah tells you Shmita or tells you Maser Oni in the specific years. But there is a separate verse, not to do with Shmita, that says, when the poor person comes and asks you for aid, surely open up your hand and give it to them. It doesn't mention an amount. It doesn't mention 10%. It doesn't mention anything along those lines. But it says you should give to him. Now, most of the commentaries there say it's a loan, that you're to give a poor person a loan, an interest-free loan. That's the mitzvah of tzedakah. The rabbis changed that over time. When we left sort of being an agricultural society of the Tanakh and became sort of more of a commercial society in the times of the Talmud. So it's not really the basis of tzedakah, but it plays a role in the whole discussion. So you're supposed to, as I said, going back, so the Ramban gives this nice idea about you should enjoy the fruit, but by and large, you have to treat this fruit differently. The best thing to do is to eat it. And by the way, eat all of it. I wish I had an apple here. I once showed this to my kids. It's an amazing thing, and if any of you want to see it, you're not supposed to waste anything. Now, normally when you eat an apple, you always waste the core. But you can actually eat it differently. And if you look on YouTube, you can ask, eat an apple from the bottom up, something to that effect. If you start biting an apple at the bottom, you do not taste the core. And you can actually, by and large, people say we waste about 30% of the apple. You can actually eat to the very end until just maybe I'll bring an apple next week and I'll show you how to do it. But it's an amazing thing. But you should try to eat as much as possible. And if you don't eat it, you try not to waste it, right? You put it to compost or you let it decay on its own, but you don't throw it into the garbage, right? When we get to the Shmita year, we'll go over the halachot. The traditional understanding of why you do that is because it's holy. It grew during the Shmita year, it's holy. There's another opinion out there as well. When you borrow something from someone, you're allowed to use it. If you rent something from someone, you're allowed to use it. Like you rent a person a car from someone or a house. You can use it and use it for your purposes. But you're not allowed to destroy it, right? You can't say, if you blow up a car or someone's apartment that you're renting, I rented, I paid for it. You're not allowed to do it. Only the owner is allowed to destroy that which is theirs. A borrower, a renter is not. And so perhaps one of the reasons, his name is Rav Blumenzweig, who says, perhaps the reason why we don't destroy fruit of the Shmita year is to remind us of this point that we don't own the land. You see, it's not our fruit to destroy. We're only allowed, right, just to destroy something if we own it. The fact that God owns it means that we can't do it. And so the Shmita reminds us, not just for this year, but reminds us of the value that God owes anything for all time. So that might be one of the ideas. This also explains the concept of Otzer Beit Din. I'm jumping ahead a lot because when we're living through the Shmita year, everyone's familiar with all the terms. And when it's, only a few years in, we forget perhaps. There's a few different ways, and we'll talk about this at the very end. There's a few different ways to get your fruit during the Shmita year. One of them is the Heter Mechira, which we'll come back to in a little bit. And one of them is Otzer Beit Din. Otzer Beit Din says that the land is God's. The Beit Din, however, takes it over. It then can hire people to work the land. Usually what it does is it hires the farmers that already are there. It pays them an agency fee. It's not paying them for the fruit because the fruit's not theirs. It pays them an agency fee to work the land on behalf of the Beit Din. And then it doesn't actually sell the fruit. It simply asks people to pay the costs of water and paying the agency fee and things along those lines. That's one way of getting around eating Shmita produce during the Shmita year. Why should the Otzer Beit Din be allowed to work the land? If the mitzvah is, let the land lay fallow, why should they be allowed to work the land? What does it matter if it's a Jew working the land or if it's an individual Jew or a Beit Din? And the answer is because the real message of Shmita, according to this opinion, is that it's about to teach us that we don't own the land, that God owns the land. So the Beit Din is representative of the whole people, or even representative of God, you might say. And so they're allowed to work the land because they're not showing individual ownership, they're showing God's ownership. Okay, let's look at the last two of the Sefer Chinuch. The Sefer Chinuch goes on to say, number 3, there's another benefit in this matter of keeping Shmita. That is to acquire the trait of letting go of one's possessions. For there's no one more generous than he who gives without hope for recompense, of getting anything back. When you learn to give something, right, to give it up, and you're never going to get it back, right, there's a tremendous amount of generosity in that, knowing that you're not going to ever get something back. What do we say about chesed shel emet, right? Every act of chesed has a small degree of potential selfishness. Right? When you help a person, there's always a chance that that person is going to help you back. Right? There is this concept of reciprocity. In fact, there was a study done in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where people would go up and ask people sitting at a bench enjoying the artwork, would you mind making a donation to a specific cause? And they say $1, $2, up to $5, $1 to $5. And I think on average they got something like 73 cents when they would just go up and ask for that. Then they did it again with an experiment where the person would first give the individual a can of Coke that at the time of the experiment cost 50 cents. They would give them the can of Coke and say, would you be willing to make a donation to this cause? And I think the number went up to something $2. The average was $2.50. In other words, it's a very good investment to give them the Coke. And what the social scientists say, the reason why is because there's a concept of reciprocity. When you do something for someone, even if it's a small amount, very often they are prepared to give back to you. They feel that they're almost obligated to do so, and very often they give much more back. So even when you do a chesed, even if you're doing it, you think, for the most altruistic reasons, you might benefit as a result from it. So that's why we say when a person goes to a funeral that it's the chesed shel emet. Because when you go to the funeral and you pay your last respects to a person who's passed away, there is no chance that they're going to return the favor, right? And so that's chesed shel emet. And so there is this great element of chesed when you give something away and you have no expectation of ever getting it back in return. And so Shmita helps you develop that. When you look at this, right, one of the Midrashim says, a person can maybe give up ownership of something they have for an hour, right, or maybe even a day. Yeah, borrow my car, no problem. But to do for a month, that's really hard. To do for a year, it's almost impossible. In fact, the people who used to observe Shmita, the farmers, fully, and they would give it up, and they would see people going on their land, right, and picking their produce. They used to call them men of great giborim, koach gibori, that they had this incredible, almost superhero powers. And you can understand that. If someone comes into your house and just himself feel at home, for one night, makes sense. To have a guest for 2 nights, but let them take over your house for a full year, that's a very difficult thing to do. And so this helps you develop that quality. The fourth answer that he gives, and there is another benefit. The outcome of it is that a person will add to his trust in God, may he be blessed, since anyone who finds it in his heart to give and abandon to the world all of his produce of his land and his ancestral inheritance for an entire year, and educates himself and his family through this for all of his days, will never have the trait of stinginess overcome him too much, nor will he have a deficient of trust. You give up, right? The Torah actually says, people ask God, how are we going to live for a year? And when you say, you know what, I don't know how we're going to live, but it's going to be okay. That's a tremendous amount of trust. Shmita develops this sense of trust that applies in many aspects of our life. Not just parnasah, but all aspects. How am I going to find my spouse? How am I going to make this marriage work? How am I going to get a job? It's going to be okay. That if you trust God, but it's very difficult to trust in fact, that you can't see God, that God is always there with us. Shmita actually helps us, I think, develop that quality. And I want to point out, what does this actually remind us of to a certain extent, or at least reminded me? If you look at Shmot, right below the Sefer Chinuch, that this is a quality that has to be developed, not just in Shmita, but it actually is developed at the very birth of the Jewish people. So you see Shmot 16, chapter 16, verses 32 to 34. I have the Hebrew. Vayomer Moshe, zeh davar asher tzivah Hashem, melo ha'omer mimenu, limishmeret ledoretechem lema. Yiru et halechem asher ha'achalti etchem b'midbar b'otzi etchem me'eretz Yisrael. It's the man, right? You remember the man? So the manna, which by the way is a custom we have at our house Friday night for dinner for challah. We don't pass out we actually throw the bread. I think it's a Sephardi custom. One of the reasons it's thrown is that you should never have a person, you should never have the need to receive a handout from a person. That's part of the blessing. That you should never be struggling financially, that you need to receive something from a person's hand. So Sephardim are very makpi to make sure that the bread doesn't come from my hand, it comes from somewhere else. But we developed the custom, and it's based upon an older custom, of throwing it so when you receive the bread from the sky, right, it didn't come from me that I'm throwing it, it's as if you got it from the heavens, which was man. To develop, because part of Shabbat is also an element of faith. And so the man really developed emunah, right? You weren't allowed to collect and hoard. That's the natural human being, is always to collect enough to make sure that I'll be okay tomorrow and the next day. And he says you're not allowed to. The manna would disappear. It would decay. It would be disgusting if you took more than what you needed. But there was always enough for you. Some people took a little, some people a lot. Whatever their needs were, it was always there. And then, of course, on Shabbat, you had to collect enough for 2 days. It developed, and you had to believe that it was always going to come the next day. God could have made life much easier and given us, packages that last for the entire time. But God says, I want you to rely on me. I want you, not for his sake, but for our sake. Developing trust is one of the things that makes the world go around, right? Obviously in God, but also in people. If you have trust issues that you can't rely on another human being, life becomes that much less full. And you have to be able to develop trust. Trust in things, institutions, in countries, that people, that you don't want to be paranoid that the whole world is out to get you. I've often said that Judaism, to a certain extent, tries to develop a reverse paranoia, that you should believe that people are trying to help you, right? Irrationally, they're trying to help you, that people are looking out for your well-being. And you have to develop a sense of trust, and the mana helped us, in fact, do that. If you see Rashi, the importance of man and trust is so important. Rashi on that verse says, in the days of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah rebuked the people saying, why do you not engage in Torah study? They weren't learning Torah. They responded to him and said, shall we leave our work and engage in Torah? If we start learning Torah, how are we going to support ourselves? And he brought out to them the jar of manna, and he said to them, you see the Lord. It does not say here, but it says see. They would look at the man. There's a midrash that says, not a midrash, the Torah. What I just quoted, I didn't read the last line. Above, Lamed Gimel. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron, kach, take some of the man and fill up an omer's worth and put it limishmeret, for protection, for safekeeping, l'dor techem, for all times. And that's exactly what Moshe and Aaron ended up doing. And they put that in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan, ark for protection. The Edat, where the tablets were. In other words, in the central ritual elements of the Mishkan, where we have the Luchot, in the Mishkan, we also had a jar of man. Why do you need that? Because to remember the food like it was such a good restaurant? No. Aaron would show it, and then Yirmiyahu years later would show it, because that reminded the importance of having faith in Hashem, living from day to day, always being able to rely on God. I think this is the same point of Shmita. It's sort of like the precursor of Shmita in this regard, developing sense of trust and the sense of faith. Okay. That's the Sefer Chinuch's 4 answers that go along with the Rambam's 2, right? The Rambam is that it's about concern for the poor and ecological. The Sefer Chinuch focuses on faith, focuses on giving up, on not having ownership, things along those lines. I want to give you maybe 2 or 3 other possibilities. Okay, the Ibn Ezra, which is the next page. It's connected to a certain extent to what Yirmiyahu just said about learning Torah. The truth is, we don't always have enough time to learn Torah. And the Ibn Ezra says part of that is because we're so consumed with making a living. And again, sometimes you can't give it up. You know, if you are a normal individual, you'd be able to say, I need to work to make sure I can provide for my family and maybe a few extra niceties, but I don't need $50 billion. I need $1 million. I mean, you could decide what it is. Each person is going to be different. But I need enough for food. You know, if you're a Rabbi Nachman's story of the fixer, he needed $1 a day. And he would work enough time to get $1 a day, and then he would go and learn Torah and enjoy. He would get a nice piece of fish or meat and have wine. Inflation. But he had $1 a day. He had his needs covered. You need your needs covered and maybe a little bit more. But there is, unfortunately, a disease sometimes that you feel, I can't leave anything out there if I have the opportunity to take it. So the Ibn Ezra says, the Torah comes along and helps you. Comes Shmita, and you're not allowed to work. Now that you're not allowed to work, what are you going to do with yourself? It makes time for Torah. It forces you to learn Torah in this regard. When a person is from the yoke of work, he can occupy himself with Torah. There's a guy by the name of Rabbi David Shapiro who points out that this, in fact, is like all the mitzvot. The mitzvot that have to do with agriculture, such as tithing, Masir Sheni. Masir Sheni is you would take a certain portion of your crops and you had to take it with you to Yerushalayim, or you had to sell it and take the money to Yerushalayim. It's one of the oddest mitzvot in the world. I always used to try to sell this to people in America. Say, Masir Sheni is the most beautiful mitzvah in the world. What does it do? You have a certain portion of your wealth, and you have to come to Yerushalayim, and you have to go out to nice restaurants in Yerushalayim. You have to eat in Yerushalayim. What an amazing mitzvah. So why do we have that mitzvah? I argue, first of all, one, you should realize that mitzvot are not meant to penalize you. Mitzvot are actually meant to be enjoyable. Meiser Sheni is sort of a paradigm. It's good to fulfill mitzvot, but more than that, the feeling is that when you come to Yerushalayim, you are in a different environment when you are anywhere else in the world. And when you come to Yerushalayim, you meet the Kohanim, you meet the Levi'im, and they inspire you, the way they're living their lives, the way they're learning Torah. You see other people. You know, I've been trying to argue to my, she's come and spend more time in Yerushalayim, she's retiring. I say, I've never seen such active Torah learning except in Yerushalayim. Though you is a perfect example, but many places, there's classes going on. People are learning Torah all the time in this city. And so people would come to visit Yerushalayim, and they would be inspired by the environment that they see around them. That's Meiser Sheni. But they would also come up for first fruits, and they would also come up for Orla. They would come to Yerushalayim all the time. They would come to 3 pilgrimage festivals. Why do you have to come to Yerushalayim? It wasn't just about going to the Beit HaMikdash and bringing your sacrifice. It was being in this environment of holiness, of people who were concerned about trying to make the world a more holy place. This, by the way, is why Avraham came to Yerushalayim as well. Rav Hirsch points out that when God tells him to leave Or Kasdim, he doesn't say, go to a place that I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you where it is. The Hebrew is Ereka, where I will appear. Go to a place where I will appear. And Avraham has no idea where he's going to appear. And what Rav Hirsch actually says is, he decided he had heard about this place called Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim had already developed, Malchi Tzedek and others, a place where spiritual seekers would go to. And the reason why Avraham had to come to Yerushalayim is he had to go to a place where people are different because they're all seeking greater spirituality. There's an impact when you all come to a place and you meet people who are like-minded or are looking for something deeper, right? That's different than people who decide, nothing against Tel Aviv, but Tel Aviv, you're looking for something different. In New York City, you're looking for something different. Yerushalayim, you're looking for something different as well. So the mitzvah of Shmita was a way of being farmers who, by the way, very often, at least his understanding, were not the elite. They were not the scholars. They were poor working stiffs. They were the ones who had to work constantly. But we democratized educational experience, saying, you also have to have a relationship with God. You have to constantly be learning. The way we do that is come to Yerushalayim. Make sure that you show up here. And so when they didn't have the burdens of work, they had the ability to learn greater Torah. Rav Kook says something similar in the next source, where he says it wasn't just for the individual, but also for the entire nation. What Shabbat does for an individual, I have a one day a week where I'm not worried about making a living. I'm now worried about family and community and Torah and spirituality. That's what a nation needs to do as well. A nation needs to take a break and not worry for 1 out of 7 years about its GDP and start dreaming big. What do we, as a nation, what can we do in a grand scale that's different than any other nation? I want to just jump to the last point because I'm running out of time and I want to make sure at least to cover it a little bit. What might be another motivation behind Shmita? So in 2007, I think, there was a Supreme Court where, if we want to get involved in Shmita politics for a moment, there are a few different ways, as I said, you can buy your fruit. I would suggest the best way is this idea of Otzer Beit Din. Otzer Beit Din is the land remains Jewishly controlled, but it's not owned by an individual, it's run by the Beit Din. Okay, and you therefore make the argument that no one owns the land. But you also don't punish the farmers. We're 1.6% of our population. All of us are not giving up our jobs, and we're insisting that the farmer has to live on nothing. I'm now talking about practice. For 1/7, every 7 years they have to give up everything. And so Otzer Beit Din helps them out a little bit. The Haredi position, not every Haredi, and I'll talk about the Chazon Ish in a little bit, says we should get our produce only from non-Jews. We should buy from Jordan, we should buy from Egypt. Now that has some additional exceptions that are important, yeah? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The Chazon Ish found other solutions. I want to contrast I'm saying generically the Haredi position. It doesn't include everyone. It doesn't include the Ridvaz. It doesn't include the Chazon Ish. Let's say the Dati Lumi, which was the Heter Mechira. The Heter Mechira says we can't penalize these farmers. They're going to struggle, they're going to suffer. So what we do is like what we do on Pesach. They're going to sell their land. They sell it for 2 years, not 1 year. And the Shmita year is included in that year. And they sell it to non-Jews, but they're able to still benefit from the produce itself, that it's now not their land, it's not Jewish land, so they're now able to still benefit from farming there. So the Heter Mechira was attacked as being not such a true to the spirit of Shmita. The Otzer Beit Din solution was one of the solutions. The Chazon Ish rejected the Heter Mechira. He, however, went out of his way to try to find other solutions. For example, the land in the Arava, that's in the south. That's not really technically part of Eretz Yisrael, so if things are grown there, it's okay. It's not exactly. The other thing is hydroponics, to grow things that aren't in the land itself. So he found other solutions, but the solution of just buying from non-Jews, like Jordan, our enemies alike, created a big fight in 2007. You had the Chardal, okay? Most of the people in Dati Lumi accepted the Heter Mechira, okay, which until a certain stage, with conditions, or the Otzer Beit Din. Then, yeah, Otzer Beit Din seems to be the ideal on some level. So there was, however, the chief rabbinate supports the concept of Heter Mechira. But then they told their individual localized rabbis, you could do whatever you want. And there were localized rabbis who said, we will not give a kashrut certificate to anyone who follows Heter Mechira. And so a number of people who are selling their produce under the Heter Mechira, which is approved by the chief rabbinate, sued the chief rabbinate for allowing the localized rabbis not to follow the chief rabbinate. And there was an interesting case, 2007, and one of the people who gave the leading opinion is Eliakim Rubinstein. And it's a great, if I had time, I would love to read it to you. It basically sounds like, he says, listen, of course we are not a Beit Din, and we are not supposed to give psak halacha. But having said that history, and he gives the whole history of the Heter Mechira and the sources of it, and he points out that it started with Rav Spector in 1889 with a lot of support. Not everyone was thrilled by it. In fact, Rav Kook was not actually thrilled by the Heter Mechira. At first, he says he was actually opposed to it. No, he didn't start it. He renewed it. The first one started in 1889. Rav Kook renewed it in 1903 and 1910. And exactly. But he says when he was in Europe, he and his father-in-law, the Aderet, were very opposed to it because it seems that there's all these beautiful values in Shmita we just spoke about, and the Heter Mechira eliminates some of those values. But he says when he got here to the land, the Aderet, I think I actually bring this as a source somewhere. No, I don't know if I have that. Yeah. He says that there are people dying, and I was against the Heter Mechira until I came here, and he says, I can't even possibly consider being against it because people will starve to death. Rav Kook gives a few other reasons that I'm going to get to in just a moment. But Eliakim Rubinstein, the Supreme Court Justice, gives all these reasons of why the Heter Mechira existed and supports. And he eventually decides at the end of the decision, says that it's okay if people don't want to hold by the Heter Mechira. However, you can't penalize people who are holding by the Heter Mechira, and to not allow a person to get a certificate of kashrut is a penalization, and so therefore the chief rabbinate has to approve that it's okay to do so. And even if this requires an additional payment from the government, then the government does have to pay that to help provide for this. Now, why did this all come about? What? The government increased the budget to help farm and to make sure because one of the arguments, by the way, no, not Heter Mechira. Just if there's additional rabbis who have to be involved in providing the supervision or things like that, meaning there is a greater burden. He was admitting that there's a greater burden on people. So why did this come about? So you spoke about Rav Kook. Rav Kook, there was a big fight in his day about whether or not to have the Heter Mechira. And as I mentioned, there were a couple things that he did to argue for it. He actually was hesitant. Oh, that's the first source I say. From afar, when we heard the arguments of those who permit and those who forbid, we leaned towards the stricter opinion. When Derek arrived in the land of Israel, he saw with his own eyes that it is impossible to even consider not making some sort of arrangement for the sabbatical year. The Rav Kook goes on and says, I understand the other opinion. In fact, I want to support the other opinion, but I see the struggle that people have. And when people started boycotting these farmers who followed the Heter Mechira, actually says there was a Chilul Hashem. That's the second paragraph that I have there. He says it's a terrible thing, and that they want to take only from. No, this is now Rav Kook. That he says they only want they only want to buy specifically from Gentiles who are also our enemies. He says this is a terrible thing. Reasons why he supports the Heter Mechira. He gives two other reasons as well. One of them is says it's really all about Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael. If you look at the third Rav Kook, the Jewish Colonial Association representative informed me that the JCA is preparing to buy much more property in the Holy Land. Remember, we're talking returning to the land, and people had to buy the land. But if we, the rabbis, decide that there is no permit to allow work on the seventh year via some legal sale, then the representative will be forced to advise that they should instead invest their money in Canada. That was an alternative way of letting Jews go to Canada. In Buffalo, there's an island that actually succeeded of Jews near Buffalo, of an entire society of farmers. It was part of a whole movement. You're absolutely right. Deciding how are we going to get farmers, Jewish farmers, either in Israel or elsewhere. And he says we have to make sure that it can work here in Israel. It's about building up the land. And we therefore have to find solutions. And he didn't create the Heter Mechira, but he says the Heter Mechira is based on sound halachic ground. Aren't better, but it's the same thing like with selling our chametz. It's based upon halacha. You're not making it up out of the blue. It doesn't mean there aren't better ways that you don't have to sell your... But he says, for a person to be machmir, that's okay. But when we're in the realm of a state, and we're talking about bringing Jews in, he goes on and says, and what about the fact, he didn't know this at the time, Rav Melamed is projecting back on him in one of the other paragraphs on the right-hand side, what about the fact that Jews are actually now needing a place to escape communism and eventually Nazism? We have got to make every effort possible to get them here, and so therefore if they're an appropriate halachic solution, we should follow that appropriate halachic solution. Rav Melamed goes on and says, the last paragraph, the real fight at that time was about the mitzvah of Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael. The Heter is based on the mitzvah of Yeshuv Eretz Haaretz, of returning to the land, building up the land, which our sages have said is equivalent to all of the mitzvot. In other words, this is a super mitzvah of returning to Israel. And so therefore, if returning to Israel means that we have to find leniencies in other mitzvot, we have to do so. And he explains, Rav Melamed explains this is the fundamental argument that takes place even today in the 2007 Supreme Court case. He says there were people who were Haredi, what we call Haredi Lumi, and then also Haredi non-Lumi, non-nationalistic. We're arguing over the Heter Mechira, and they're both being stringent. Why did one hold? Rav Melamed is in the Haredi Lumi perspective. He says, I think it's more strict to not give money to our potential enemies. And so therefore, I think, he wasn't necessarily talking about necessarily just the Heter Mechira, Otzer Beit Din, but he says buying from our enemies doesn't make sense at all, because it comes back to Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael. He then attacks the other Haredi position, and he says he thinks what really started this all in the early 1900s was an opposition to secular Zionism. When secular Zionism and they're building up the land, Rav Kook says we need this to take place because we need more and more Jews, and so therefore he was prepared to make accommodations. The other position said secular Zionism is a terrible thing because they don't believe in God, they're apikorsim, all these different. So therefore, Rav Melamed argues that the Heter Mechira actually has sound halachic basis, more so than many of the other kulas that exist, and the opposition therefore is not fully rational, and it must be because it's political. It's trying to argue against secular Zionism. There you see it, the continuation. He says, not working the fields in the Shmita year was liable to cause great damage to the settlements because apart from it, the difficulties of immigration and settlement were enormous. And only a small number of Jews agreed to move to Israel. How much more so would they be if they decreased and they couldn't work during the Shmita year? There the rabbi saw a great need to find a heter in order to expropriate the fields from the obligation of Shmita, and it becomes much more serious. Then Rav Kook, above that, argues we have to make Judaism relevant, and he's now talking about the secular farmers. We want to include them, and so therefore that's another reason why we should support the heter. All this goes to one of the I think underlying motivations for heter mechira and therefore Shmita in general is the importance of Eretz Yisrael in the fulfillment of the Torah in general. And so therefore you see someone like a Rav Kook, who we think of as the champion of heter mechira, but when you actually felt uncomfortable with it, but he was willing to put aside his discomfort because he felt that it would increase Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And in a similar way, a Rav Melamed, who is perhaps a spiritual descendant of Rav Kook, today comes out also, even though he's if you know Rav Melamed, he's fairly stringent, and he supports chumras personally. But here too, he tries to find kulas because he felt that it's the more Zionist thing to do of strengthening Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as opposed to weakening it through supporting agriculture from other countries. Okay, I've gone over. I will end there. Maybe we'll continue on the topic at some point in time in the future.